Always the thing with the microphones.
Yes.
Doesn't matter if you're teaching a class or at a seminar like this, all right? Now I can even hear it myself. Better. This initiative, the CMI as we call it, BME in Swedish, was initiated following the 2015 asylum-seeking situation that we had. And my focus, my interest has been mainly during my thesis project, my PhD thesis project, it was on asylum law and procedure. We have an Aliens Act in place since 2005, so I interviewed MPs, members of parliament, about how they negotiated that law, what kind of priorities they made, how they experienced that process, but also their views on unaccompanied minors, which you can say was very conflicted, because of course you have this children's rights discourse that children deserve the best, children are the most important thing that we have, etc., etc. But you also have this view of unaccompanied children as carrying around a huge deficit that is a kind of societal risk that they might. The idea goes among these politicians end up conducting criminal activities, so they might be difficult to integrate, etc. Conflicted and stereotyping, to say the least. And I've also been interested in how the Swedish Migration Agency writes decisions, so the practical side, not on how they implement the law, how they view credibility, and how they assess credibility in first decisions, how do they handle different types of asylum claims, and I've looked at this from different angles, particularly the principles that they use when they write the first decisions. I've looked at more than 2,000, actually, of those decisions from one calendar year. It was 2011. And what I can say shortly about that is that they have a very restrictive way of arguing and building arguments about credibility with disregard of what the child says about the migration experience. Everything basically is critiqued, which leaves very little room for the individual assessment that is so often lifted in political debate. That's a very important core of asylum procedure. And my current research is on the guardianship institution that we have for unaccompanied minors. It looks quite good on paper that every child in Sweden needs to have a guardian to represent them, and also in this case, as unaccompanied minors do not have their parents with them in the country, to help avoid legal abuse, to be simply run over by different type of agencies and be the spider in the web, which is the recurring sentence that I hear a lot when I'm doing field work. But in practice, there's a shortage of guardians constantly, and there might be weeks or months even before an unaccompanied child gets a permanent guardian for the asylum process, if we say so. It's not always that guidelines go together with what happens in reality, if we say so. And as I mentioned, we do have a long history of researching and discussing these issues. And it's actually been on the table in Sweden since 1988, more or less, following the Iran-Iraq war, mainly. But the statistics that we have has not been reliable since 1996, although it is 20 plus years. And during this time, there has been a lot of good practice actually identified, both from the practitioner side itself and the research side. To mention a few, my former supervisor, for example, Ann-Kristin Cederborg, already in 2004 developed different types of interview guides and guidelines for the migration agency to use, interviewing asylum-seeking children. In the recommended method, following forensic psychology, how to use open-ended questions, how to not place suggestive ideas into the interview, introduce that into the interview, for example. We have also had researchers like Olga Kesselman, who has explored the role of the interpreter during the asylum interview, and of course social workers and others are also very dependent on the interpreter, and from that we know also that the interpreter might restrict the child's participation, even if the social worker use a very good interview technique, and that might depend on there might be very different reasons for that, competence, etc. In some languages like Somali, last time I checked, there's no authorized interpreters in Somali, for example. We also know quite a lot about how their life in Sweden turns out after being granted residency. There's been follow-up studies, both quantitative ones and qualitative. And I'm going to mention some of that in brief time. And we also know quite a bit about integration measures that work. For example, family reunification can provide stability when a person wants to integrate in society. Having a permanent residency also makes it easier to predict the future and make the strategic choices that you need to integrate, to plan for a long-term stay in the country, for example, maybe with an eye to apply for citizenship a few years down the line. We also know quite a lot from psychological and psychiatric research about the mental health, that the waiting for asylum can have a passive effect and can cause different types of stress and aggression. There might also be expectations that the child feels from taking care of or providing for family and relatives because they might have worked prior to the migration experience to help to provide for the family. And also the family might have taken loans, etc., to finance the trip. We know a lot about media images, the conflicting view on migration in general. There has been some work done on belonging by Ulrika Wernesjö, for example, who is now at Linköping University. She graduated from Uppsala with a PhD on belonging in unaccompanied minors. There's also been contributions, as I mentioned, from the practitioner side, psychotherapeutic work. I know at least 2 books in Swedish that's come out in the recent 2 years where psychotherapists have written about their experiences of conducting treatment with unaccompanied minors over many, many years. So that we know quite a lot about, and they usually start out at some kind of attachment perspective and discuss a lot about coming from a collective culture where the family is very central to a very individualistic culture, if you call it that, like the Swedish one. And even within the Swedish Migration Agency, you've had quite a lot of routine handbooks and handbooks about the guidelines, etc., being developed, but still we have different issues that remain and can be explained as viewed as a problem. Because what do we actually know about, if we look at think about the follow-up, about how well they integrate, if we use that word. I know in Sweden anyway, the word integration is quite debated as well, but if we use that term. So, for example, Ayşen Çelikaksoy and Eskil Wernesjö has done statistical work using register data and discovered that actually the integration into the labor market is quite successful. They integrate even better than children arriving with their parents, accompanied minors that it would be. They tend to work in the service and care sectors, for example, within elderly care. We also know that refugee girls do not work to the same extent, and we know that if the unaccompanied minors settle in an urban area, like a large city like Stockholm, they tend to be in employment quicker than if they live in a rural setting, which of course follows some general patterns between rural and urban, that there might be more work available and more flexibility in the urban area and other types of networks. We also know that because there has been a discourse that they contribute to crime, high crime rates, etc., which and particularly of a sexual nature, which has been debunked both the government made a general statement about to putting the record straight, kind of on migrants and the crime rates last year. But also we know that it follows the patterns from other populations, like the general population, that there's usually a small portion within the group that contributes to most of the statistics in that sense. So that's also nothing that really differs from the general Swedish population, if you call it that. And we also know from the demographic side that the Swedish population would decrease, and that we will be even more dependent on the foreign-born contribution to the labour market, particularly by 2035. So we actually are very much in need of young people to kind of come in, if we look at it from a strictly economist kind of way. And also that we don't actually have to pay, for example, for the entire basic education, that they already have something with them when they come, if we only think about like the economics of it, because sometimes it's always viewed as just a burden, a kind of cost for the state budget, and etc. And the political focus in the country has been, prior to 2015, it has been very much focused on the ideas of anchor children or apathetic children. The apathetic side would be faking illness to receive a residency, and the anchor variant would be that the child comes first and then the parents would follow after and kind of sideway their way into getting residency in Sweden. And there have been follow-up done by the migration agency itself a few years back that show that only about 10% of the unaccompanied minors have some kind of family reunification happening. So it's a very small number percentage-wise. There's also been a strive for return since day one. That this has been discussed. There was even a project called ERPUM a while back that tried to establish institutional care orphanages, to put it plainly. In Kabul, for example, those negotiations failed. We now have, since last year, a temporary Aliens Act, so we actually have two on top of each other. That was very quickly negotiated, which has had negative consequences for unaccompanied minors because it has limited also the possibility of family reunification, and it has received quite a lot of critique for not having any kind of child perspective or child consequence analysis. From the political side, we've heard a lot about sending signals that Sweden is not a welcoming society. In the way of closing the border, we've had strict border controls towards Denmark, for example, to reduce the inflow, which, as I mentioned, has gone down. You've had the security risk discourse, the risk of terrorism, and the risk for gender equality, for example, even though, of course, the gender dynamics that exists in the larger part of Swedish society kind of ends up in the back mirror. And there's still a strive for return, although in practice it's very difficult to deport to Afghanistan, for example, and now they have come up with a temporary solution of making temporary high school residency permits. And the key word here would be temporary, because again we have this kind of instability that's being brought in for the minors, and no one really knows how to interpret the law, this regulation in particular, and no one really knows what's going to happen after. So this is a very temporary idea that has put into place. And there's also a discussion about the guardianship that I'm following quite closely. Should it be a layman, which it is now? Should it be a layman assignment, or should it be professionalized into having, for example, social workers doing that kind of work? And if you have laymen, so where are the limits for that type of responsibility? We have 290 municipalities, and even though there are some national regulations, it's still very much up to the municipalities, how they organize it on the ground, so to speak. So these are the numbers. In 2015, we had the top, if you call it that. But as you can see, it's gone down quite drastically. I can't do the percentages in my head, unfortunately, but yeah, it's more than 90% drop easily. And this follows from the border and ID checks that have been set up in Öresund. And of course, it also follows from the EU external border policies that have been implemented. The reason for this restriction against unaccompanied minors in the political conversation and administrative conversation is that that adults would try to make themselves younger than they are to receive some benefits. The benefits would be the network that exists formally anyway around the child, the social worker having a guardian, having an asylum procedure where the best interests of the child principle needs to be regarded, even though you could say that it's not always anyway. And that the evidence assessment is a bit lighter, if we call it that, for children than adults. But as I mentioned, the studies I've done show that it's quite slim anyway, so in that sense, I would argue that you wouldn't really gain much being a child. Actually, you have a few other barriers that you need to pass instead. Because, for example, something adults are not subjected to are different kind of physical assessments, like the age assessment, which has been very much discussed and is now implemented again. For a while, it went down the frequency of trying to conduct age assessment, but the government made a turn in 2016, wanting more age determinations. The National Board of Forensic Medicine had concluded out of, quite surprisingly, that they can do quite correct age assessment, because the lit reviews done in medicine, etc., before that show that it's very hard to conduct, but here we have an agency that says that they know that it's possible to do. The National Health Board has adopted kind of a middle ground in this. The political level really want age assessments in place. Against, we have the Pediatric Medicine Association that says that it's, medically unsafe procedure to get any kind of valuable result. The Swedish Bar Association says that it's not useful in the legal process, that they don't want to see it being used. And of course, you have the different civil society actors to say that are fiercely against it. If we look at the age issue in particular, because this is the big topic of discussion, we have, for example, a researcher at the law school in Stockholm, Simon Andersson. I went to one of his seminars recently, and because the age comes into also a type of assessment issue. The general rule when someone applies for asylum is, as in other parts of administrative law, that if you want something from the state, like say a benefit, if you want to apply for student aid, etc., you are the one that needs to show that you are entitled, and the same rule applies in asylum. However, the principles that they are applying for this are kind of goes against how the system works in other cases, because here you need to, it's formulated as the person needs to make probable that he or she is below 18. Probable is, as you can interpret, not a very high, actually, limit. So you just need to make it probable. And it's also interesting that you need to prove that you are not something. Usually, like the asylum claim, you need to prove the positive sense that it has happened with your asylum narrative. But here you need to prove that something is not the case. Which is legally a bit more controversial. Sorry. Because in that case, if you have a negative weight against you, also following the general principle of administrative law that we have, then the responsibility of the agency to conduct investigations to kind of help and balance this, their responsibility and accountability would increase, but it actually doesn't. Rather, they apply it in a way that it needs to be shown that the person is 18, which is very difficult for a child to actually do. Because when you get these results back, you have, for example, it strongly indicates, this would be one example, it strongly indicates, say 30%, that person is above 18. But then it indicates that the person can be over 18, 25%. I just made this up as an example. It's possible that the person is above 18, and then you have 25% saying that it's possible that the person is below 18. So actually, the strong indication is 30%, but the rest is actually 70%. If we look at it that way. So then need to make probable. Is it probable? It's actually very uncertain, but the way the migration board applies it is that they take the bigger number, 30%, and say that, well, it's been shown that he's actually above. So this goes against how cases would be handled in other types of administrative cases. Yep. And of course, if it needs to be proved in a criminal case, then it would be beyond reasonable doubt, or otherwise it would be, so to speak, set free. But here you have a very high threshold to, in a negative way, say that you are not an adult. Sweden has also received critique that child-specific forms of persecution are not clarified. The age assessment that I just mentioned is one huge component in this, but there are also other types of testing, like language testing done in asylum cases. For example, the dialect, are they from North or South Somalia? Is it from this province of Afghanistan, or is it this province in Afghanistan? And this, of course, takes place within a larger context of stress, learning, being introduced to school, having a caseworker at the social services, you have the guardian, you have, of course, the housing staff that has the daily care responsibility, you might have a contact person, and you might be in contact with psychiatric care. So there are very many actors involved as this actually takes place in the asylum procedure. So this is what I mean, that unaccompanied children might actually have more to kind of keep track of than an adult asylum applicant would. And we also have quite long times for a first decision in asylum cases for unaccompanied minors right now. It's about 1.5 years of uncertainty. And the temporary law, as I mentioned, it's on top of each other too. And it's reached the EU minimum limit, so to speak. So you have the Refugee Convention, and then you have the EU law for subsidiary possibilities of granting asylum. But the rest, all the national provisions that we've had, are kind of put on hold. And quite many, about 25% of unaccompanied minors, would receive residency earlier due to particularly distressing circumstances, which kind of have a humanitarian aspect, but this means that this is not possible anymore, and the effect could be, we haven't seen the end of that yet, but more rejections and more unaccompanied minors ending up in having this high school permit that no one really knows how to apply yet. The topics that had related to this restriction is, of course, that we've had a series of suicides and attempted suicides. We know very little about it. There's been a strike. Anna-Kaisa mentioned the self-organization that takes place. There's been a sitting strike in Stockholm. There are indications of higher rates of substance abuse, more children in psychiatric care, children going missing. They're quite high numbers. We know very little. There are very little reliable statistics available. Even in Sweden, we have a keyword that comes up a lot, which is samverkan, collaboration, basically between different actors. But exactly how that's going to take place, nobody knows. And of course, you have a trafficking discourse that these children are really trafficked and not really asylum seekers, etc. And you have the critique that the trafficking discourse can also contribute to higher repression, that people should kind of turn children in if they think, children that are in hiding, so that they will be deported. And you have the discourse on Moroccan street children, which we also know very little about. There's very little statistics and resources available for that group, since they very rarely receive any kind of asylum and kind of end up outside the system. This is the last slide. And the public sector, how it has responded. When I'm out doing fieldwork and meeting practitioners, social services, the social worker says that they are overworked, there are high rotation within units, They're underfunded, basically. The migration agency is also underfunded. Every asylum case officer gets a higher portion of cases awarded to them, but not more pay and not more hours and not more colleagues. Actually, now, after 2015, it was just announced a couple of weeks ago that 1,200 asylum case officers are being made redundant. They're being let go. And the lower numbers also has led to the closing down of a lot of housing centers for unaccompanied minors. And at the same time, the ones that remain, we have a larger dynamics of a housing shortage in about 255 municipalities of 290 in the country. So this is more of a welfare state issue at large that kind of has connections to this. This was different from the situation in 1992, for example, the Yugoslav wars, when we had a more welfare state resources in place, so to speak. There has been a turn to austerity since then. And with the influx in 2015 has also showed how dependent the public sector is on the civil society. We had quite many of NGOs and voluntary, surprisingly many voluntary organization volunteers all over the country going out to help and donating everything from diapers to clothes, etc., to refugees coming in, waiting at stations. So that was very visible at the time. But also something that we are keen to know is how can knowledge and experience transfer when you have this kind of putting your foot on the pedal of the car and moving forward, and then as soon as the numbers go down, you kind of let people go, and then you kind of restart a few years later, because that's something that we've been struggling with quite a long time. After the invasion of Iraq, for example, there were quite many that came, many asylum case officers were employed, you had housings, etc., then the numbers went down, everyone was let go, the housings were closed down. You can see this goes up and down with kind of a climate change of 5 years. And how do you actually transfer all that we actually know, the good practices, but don't really put into place? That was it. Thank you.